Today, we're in Tishomingo County and headed up to the rooftop of Mississippi. Hi, I'm Skye Marthaler. Welcome to Rooftops of America. Today, we're heading up to the highest point in the Magnolia State. But before we start this adventure, take a moment to click that red subscribe button below and the bell icon next to it for all the latest Rooftops of America updates. Located in the northeast corner of Mississippi, you'll find Woodall Mountain. This peak rises up near the southwest edge of the city of Iuka. While it'd be called a hill pretty much anywhere else in the country, here in the Magnolia State, it reigns supreme. Almost all of Mississippi can be lumped in the much larger Gulf Coastal Plain that stretches across the U.S. South, and most of the state would have been underwater up until about 66 million years ago. Erosion from ancient mountains, the Appalachians and Central Highlands, slowly piling up, forming the coastal plain. As you may already expect, Mississippi is not exactly a state that is known for elevation. That said, it does have an interesting physical geography, and you can find 4 distinct regions. You've got the Gulf Coast, the Yazoo Basin, the Pine Belt, and up here, the Northern Hills. In this particular area, you'll find narrow ridgetops and valleys, predominantly covered by oak, hickory, and pine forests. The makeup of these hills is predominantly sand and gravel, providing them with an average elevation of about 650 feet above sea level. It's enough to make this the highest elevated region in the state. Woodall Mountain, though, stands above many of its counterparts due to an interesting geological factor. It's what's known as a monadnock, an isolated hill or mountain that stands conspicuously above the general elevation of the surrounding area. This peak is an erosional remnant that has proved to be more resistant to the passage of time and its erosive effects. That's due to having caprock that is composed of a layer of iron-rich red sandstone. While Woodall Mountain is an interesting landform in its own right, if you really want to explore the geological makeup of this area, then I recommend coming to here, Tishomingo State Park. It's about 15 miles south of the Highpoint, and I guarantee it'll be worth your time. For starters, it's one of the most unique landscapes you'll find in Mississippi. This place provides a feeling of elevation and ruggedness that you won't find in other places in the state, and the exposed rock is some of the oldest in the Magnolia State, dating back to the Devonian period 400 million years ago. Another reason to come here is you can get in a hike. Woodall Mountain isn't exactly what you would call a hiking high point, but here at Tishomingo State Park, they've got 13 miles of trails. And if you are interested in exploring that geological makeup of the area, then I would recommend the Outcropping Trail. Let's go check it out. Humans have been living in this part of Mississippi dating back thousands of years. There's been archaeological findings of Paleo-American activity and settlements here dating as far back as 7000 BCE. These people would have lived in a radically different Mississippi than the one we see today. Mastodons, bisons, ground sloths, and other megafauna would have roamed these lands, and the flora would have been more akin to what we see further north. As the effects of the glaciers lessened, Mississippi and the other lands down here would change. Societies and cultures would rise and fall, with settlements cropping up on the rivers. One of the best examples is Far Mounds, about 30 miles southwest of Iuka. This site was an active trading center dating back 2,000 years ago. Spanish conquistador Hernando de Soto and his expedition were the first Europeans to travel through this part of Mississippi. They'd passed through here in late 1540, early 1541. It's unknown if he or his soldiers ever laid eyes on Woodall Mountain. If they did, they left no record on it. De Soto did encounter the Chickasaw Nation, who would dominate this area for the next 250 years. De Soto's expedition greatly affected the tribes here, spreading diseases the natives had no immunities against. Despite De Soto's expedition, or maybe even because of its failure, this particular area remained out of the gaze of the colonial expansionist powers. It wasn't until the late 17th century when they finally found something here that piqued their interest. 140 years after De Soto, the French would start to colonize the area, beginning in 1682, when René Robert LaSalle, while exploring the Mississippi River, claimed the territory for the French crown, naming it Louisiana. Most of the French colonization efforts would happen on the rivers and coasts, Biloxi getting started in 1699, and Fort Rosalie, now modern-day Natchez, being established in 1716. Initial European settlement in Mississippi was slow and troubled, to say the least. Economically, this was a bit of a money pit, and it was never easy to convince settlers to come here. On top of that, the French abused their relationship with their native neighbors. Things would come to a head when they demanded land that was sacred to the Natchez for their own use. The Natchez had had enough, and they responded by attacking the French and killing hundreds of people. The French responded even more ruthlessly, and over the course of 2 years, basically wiped out the Natchez tribe. This is merely a prelude of future atrocities to come. Despite setbacks, multiple European crowns laid claim to various parts of Mississippi. France claimed it in its entirety as a part of the aforementioned Louisiana. The English claimed the northern part as part of the Georgia colony, whereas the Spanish staked a claim on the southern section as part of Spanish Florida. After the American Revolution, the United States received a significant chunk of territory from Great Britain, stretching from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River. In 1798, the Mississippi Territory was established, but in the beginning it only included about the southern third of present-day Alabama and Mississippi, not including the panhandles, though. The highest point in this initial bit would have been in Barbour County in Alabama, with an elevation over 690 feet. Things would change only a few years later with the purchase of the Louisiana Territory. This gave Congress the freedom to expand the Mississippi Territory to the north, where it now lined up with the border of its eastern neighbor, the state of Georgia. Along with this growth in territory, the territory highpoint would shift as well, moving to Alabama's current state highpoint of Woodall Mountain, with an elevation of 2,413 feet. The Mississippi Territory took its name from the river that made up its western border. What's most interesting about this is the name isn't from these parts. was brought down from the north. The name Mississippi is actually a French derivation of the original Ojibwe word, which means the Great River. While the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico formed a natural trade corridor on the western side, here in the interior, it was a little different. It wasn't that this area was isolated, far from it. It was connected to the larger world by the Tennessee and Tombigbee rivers. It was also home to one of the great early roads in American history, the Natchez Trace. These days, the Natchez Trace is a 440-mile-long highway stretching from Nashville, Tennessee to Natchez, Mississippi, a distance that can easily be done with a long day of driving. But 2 centuries earlier, it was a much more grueling affair. President Thomas Jefferson called this route the Columbian Highway and ordered it expanded in the early 1800s to drive the growth of the territory. But it had existed for hundreds of years by that time. It was originally a migration path for animals, and later native tribes improved it into a regularly traveled pathway. De Soto and his expedition, they would be the first Europeans to cross over the Natchez Trace on their way to the Mississippi River. By that time, it was already a well-established trade route with numerous native settlements along it. Now, the first account we have of a European traveling any significant length on it was a Frenchman. We don't know his name, but his writings suggest it was an absolutely miserable experience. Even after improvements, it was never an easy route, plagued with highwaymen and bandits as it cut through what was then the American Southwest frontier. Still, it would serve a vital role in the growth of Mississippi as more settlers arrived in the territory. The Highpoint would shift one more time to its current location only 13 years later, when this area shed its territorial status and became a state. Originally, it was proposed that it should be named Washington, but by the time the votes were tallied, the name Mississippi stuck, and it became the 20th state on December 10th, 1817. Despite gaining statehood, here in northeastern Mississippi, these were still Chickasaw lands. The Chickasaw Nation had deep roots in this area and had long been one of the dominant tribes. They had resisted earlier French efforts, but now American settlers were encroaching on their territory. The Chickasaw were considered one of the 5 civilized tribes in the fact that they had adopted European customs and styles. They had been staunch allies for the U.S. in its early days, fighting alongside the Army in multiple conflicts. Throughout the latter decades of the 18th and into the early 19th centuries, the Chickasaw were led by Chief Tishomingo, who had honorably served alongside American forces in several conflicts, being awarded a silver medal by George Washington, and later serving with General Andrew Jackson in the War of 1812. None of these factors would save the Chickasaw from the atrocity that was the Indian Removal Act of 1832. They would be forced off their lands in Mississippi and relocated to Oklahoma along the Trail of Tears. It would be the most traumatic event in the tribe's history, and it's one that continues to stain our national fabric to this day. After the forced departure of the Chickasaw, this area was organized into counties. Tishomingo County, named, in a bit of bitter irony, after the Chickasaw chief who had just been evicted, was established in February 1836, one of a dozen counties formed that year from the Chickasaw cession of land. The first American town in this area was Jacinto, settled the same year the county was established.
Economically, this area was driven by logging and small farms, and growth here would be slow. That is, until a new form of transportation would open this area to the wider world.
It was the railroad that would draw more attention to this area. The Memphis and Charleston Railroad would pass through here, though this wasn't the first choice. Originally, the track wanted to go through the established community of Eastport, but the town refused to allow them, so the railroad went southwest. Eastport's decision would doom the town, the people there moving towards the newer towns of Corinth, established in 1853, and Iuka 4 years later in 1857. While there are other more impressive high points out there, there's one aspect of Woodall Mountain different from all the rest, that of a battlefield. This peak would play witness and participate in a U.S. Civil War battle that, while small, would become noteworthy for a strange natural phenomenon.
A battle here doesn't seem obvious at first glance. By the late 1850s, this was very much a small town, just a couple hundred people. But the railroad that had brought about the development of Iuka now drew unwelcome attention. The U.S. Civil War erupted in 1861, and by the following year, 1862, this part of Mississippi was the scene of much maneuvering by both Union and Confederate forces.
The cause for this fight was driven by demands in Tennessee and Kentucky. Union General Don Carlos Buell and his counterpart, Confederate General Braxton Bragg, were both clamoring for more troops. Bragg to advance his Confederate Heartland offensive, and Buell to thwart it. In turn, their respective subordinate commanders, General Ulysses Grant for the North and General Sterling Price for the South, decided it was necessary to prevent the other from sending men to Tennessee.
The key to both sides of the equation was control of the Memphis-Charleston Railroad. This was the only east-west rail running throughout the Confederacy. So, control of it meant being able to supply troops, but also prevent the other side from reinforcing. And with that knowledge, it painted a bullseye right on Iuka.
Everything came to a head on September 19, 1862, when Union troops moved in to engage the Confederate force holding Iuka. Union forces numbered around 4,500 men, and the Confederates just over 3,000. The fighting began in the late afternoon and would carry on for the next several hours until darkness set in. General Rosecrans, leading the Union forces currently engaged in the battle, described Woodall Mountain and the surrounding area as such. The ground was horrid, unknown to us, and no room for development. The irony of that statement was he'd actually been stationed in Iuka, but was not able to exploit his knowledge of the terrain to his advantage. But it may not have been his fault. General Rosecrans wasn't operating alone. He was one part of a much larger force, and he was expecting reinforcement once the battle had been joined. Reinforcements that never came.
Command and control is absolutely critical to battlefield success. In a time before radio communications, for commanders, they had to rely heavily on listening and sight. It's hard to imagine these days with our modern tech, but sound was often the most efficient and quickest way a commander had to know how a battle was unfolding. And the intensity of the fighting in various locations was one of the dependent factors on how troops would be deployed.
The Union left, under the command of General Ord, had been ordered to hold fast until they heard sounds of battle. Despite the pitched fighting that Rosecrans' troops were engaged in, neither Ord nor Grant heard any sounds of fighting.
So, what happened? Well, the short answer is nature and geography. Now, the longer answer is a phenomenon known as an acoustic shadow, which is basically an obstruction or an event that disrupts sound waves. In this case, on that particular September day, it was incredibly windy. And that wind, quite literally, carried the sounds of battle away from Ord and Grant.
Woodall Mountain's role in the battle was predicated on its defining factor, its commanding height, which would have made it an ideal observation point to monitor events as they unfolded. Keep in mind, during this time period, this area would have been a lot less wooded, the trees logged and cleared for farming and construction.
A majority of the fighting that day took place northeast of Woodall Mountain. But there are reports that the Confederates made multiple bloody assaults up a hill to dislodge a Union battery that was there. On the first two assaults, they had been thrown back. But on the third, the rebels overwhelmed the Union artillery.
While the rebel forces were able to capture the Union guns, in a bit of irony, they were not able to capitalize on it. In the ferocity of the fighting, all the horses had been killed, so the guns remained where they were emplaced.
For the size of this engagement, it was exceptionally bloody. Over a third of the total forces that fought in this battle would become casualties, killed in action, wounded, missing, or captured. For the victorious Union, they lost 790 men. For the Confederate forces, it was significantly worse, suffering 1,500 casualties.
The battle would leave Iuka devastated, and it would take decades for it to fully recover. In the more immediate aftermath, this was the start of a longer campaign. A month later, the Second Battle of Corinth would end in a defeat for the Confederacy and allow the Union to focus its attention on capturing Vicksburg, the last rebel stronghold on the Mississippi. Its capture the following year would be one of the major turning points of the U.S. Civil War.
These days, the Iuka battlefield has basically been lost to the progress of man. Most of it has drastically changed from what it would have been in the 1860s, overgrown with trees or underbrush or developed roads, houses, the works. This place right here is Goyer Cemetery, and it's one of the very few places that is relatively unchanged from what it would have been back on that fateful day in the 1860s. The other constant is Woodall Mountain, still looming large over Iuka. It is the bloodiest high point in the United States.
While Woodall Mountain is in the bottom 5 of state high points, it does stand tall in this part of the world. It's the only peak in Mississippi to exceed 800 feet. One of the best places to get a view of this peak is here at the county fairgrounds, where you can really take in the relief compared to the surrounding environment.
That this region was home to the Mississippi State High Point was known relatively early. There's a description of Tishomingo County from the late 1830s that describes it as such.
In this county are the highest lands of the state. The height of Bull Mountain must exceed 800 feet.
At present, there is no named mountain in Mississippi known as Bull Mountain. So perhaps the reference to Bull Mountain was actually an even earlier name for Woodall Mountain.
Woodall Mountain's height above the surrounding area make it stand out, enough so that it has been suggested it may have played a role in guiding escaped slaves to freedom.
The song "Follow the Drinking Gourd" has entered American folklore as a coded map for fugitive slaves to make their way from Alabama up north. Now, the part that pertains to Woodall Mountain can be found in the third verse of certain versions. The lyrics are as follows.
The first river reference is the Tombigbee River, whose headwaters end south of Woodall Mountain. The other river referenced is the Tennessee, which lies a few miles north of the peak. As the tallest landform in the area, Woodall Mountain makes for a natural point of reference between the two.
Now, there's still some debate whether this is an accurate interpretation of the song, but there is one thing you can't refute, and that is that Woodall Mountain is one of the most noteworthy landmarks in this part of Mississippi.
The first official name of this landform was Yow Hill, probably a more fitting description in relation to its size. It was most likely named after George Yow and his family, who lived in the area in the 1800s. It would gain its current name when it was renamed in the latter part of the 19th century after Zephaniah Woodall, the Tishomingo County sheriff, who had purchased the land. Woodall originally wasn't from these parts. He hailed from Alabama, moving to the area in the 1860s. He'd raise a family and serve as sheriff for a dozen years. Eventually, he'd move west again. And if you were to look for his gravesite, you'll find it in Hillsboro, Texas.
To get to the top of Woodall Mountain, you start right here at the intersection of Route 176 and Woodall Mountain Road. This mile-long dirt road will take you right to the top. Now, you've got an option. You can either hike it or you can drive it. Today, we're going to drive it. Let's go check it out.
These days, the area surrounding Woodall Mountain is owned by the Tombigbee Hunting Club, but there is an easement allowing the public access to the summit. That said, take a bit of caution if you decide to summit during the hunting season. Woodall Mountain can be accessed year-round with minimal difficulty, though the road can be a bit rough, so proceed with care, but you'll be up to the top before you know it.
This location is not necessarily the best when it comes to scenic views. There's just too much vegetation and trees and antenna and everything else, but you can get a few when you look down the power line breaks to get a sense of the area.
The summit isn't much to write home about. It is covered by several antennae, but in the center you'll find a large stone with a plaque giving a bit of history of the area. You'll also find a highpointer's bench nearby to take a load off. Adjacent to these two is where you'll find the benchmark.
And here we are on the summit of Woodall Mountain, the rooftop of Mississippi, with an elevation of 806 feet. This is the 47th highest state high point in the USA. I'm Skye Marthaler. Thanks for joining me on Rooftops of America. Before you go, leave a comment and click those like and subscribe buttons below, and I'll see you soon.